I'm very honored and proud now, surprisingly, to be allowed to introduce Professor Noam Chomsky. I think I don't need, he doesn't need any words of introduction. So Professor Chomsky, if you're ready, I think please just go ahead with your lecture, and I hope we can solve the problems that we had with Maria for the Q&A session afterwards. So the floor is all yours.
Thank you very much. I'm pleased to see that I'm not the only person who has technical problems. I often have to schedule talks well in advance, and sometimes I'm asked to propose titles. The request raises obvious difficulties in a world that's always changing, often rapidly. There are, fortunately, a few fallback options, titles that never fail. One I've discovered is the current crisis in the Middle East. That's sure to be appropriate. Another one is academic freedom is under threat, and a closely related one, the university in a time of crisis. The total title chosen for these remarks, these two never fail. Actually, the title for the remarks today was chosen just a few days ago, but in fact, it could have been chosen half a century earlier. In fact, it was. It happens to be the title of an article of mine in the late 1960s. And it also could have been chosen half a century before that. And in fact, it was by the great social critic, Randolph Bourne. As the First World War was grinding to its miserable close, Bourne wrote an essay about the impact of the war on the intellectual culture. I'll quote him. He wrote that the war has brought to leadership a liberal, technical intelligentsia, immensely ready for the executive ordering of events, pitifully unprepared for the intellectual interpretation or the idealistic focusing of ends, pragmatic intellectuals who have absorbed the secret of scientific method as applied to political administration, and who readily line up in the service of the war technique. Turning to the university, Bourne described it as a financial corporation, strictly analogous in its motives and responses to the corporation which is concerned in the production of industrial commodities. The university produces learning instead of steel or rubber, but the nature of the academic community has become less and less potent in ensuring for the academic workman a status materially different from that of any other kind of employee. The trustees define their obligation as to see that the quality of the commodity which the university produces is such as to seem reputable to the class which they represent. Under trustee control, the American university has been degraded from its old noble ideal of a community of scholarship, actually the ideal that Michael D. Higgins has so eloquently expounded. University has been degraded from that to a private commercial corporation. Well, if that lament from a century ago sounds up to date, it's because it is. A century after Bourne, the British cultural critic Stefan Collini condemned the educational programs of the Tory government that were seeking to impose market discipline on the academic institutions. So if Oxford wants a classics department, show that it can survive in the market. In Collini's words, the Tory government was seeking to convert first-class educational institutions into third-class commercial operations. He was repeating Bourne's lament in close paraphrase. The Tory government was threatening the cherished Haldane doctrine, which actually dates from the time that Bourne wrote during World War I. That's the doctrine that use of research funds should be made by the researchers themselves, not by politicians, not by other donors. We can certainly ask whether these ideals are actually realized in practice, just as we can ask whether Bourne's old noble ideal of a community of scholarship ever existed as more than an ideal. The answer is mixed. Looking over the centuries, the ideal has often been upheld, but it has been a constant battle to try to sustain it in the face of external, social, economic, and ideological pressures. The relation to academic freedom is too intimate and apparent to require further elaboration. I happen to have had a good vantage point to observe the struggle during the post-World War II period. My life was spent at MIT, the world's leading technological institution. And during those years, MIT changed from an engineering school to a university based on science that had a concomitant development, namely development of humanities and social sciences. That was a natural outgrowth of the transition from engineering to science, from making things to understanding them. Interestingly, this transition took place almost entirely under Pentagon funding, which in fact kept quite strictly to the Haldane principle and also to its corollary regarding internal structure of educational programs and their independence from funder influence and control. The reasons for this apparent paradox become clear when we look into the prevailing socioeconomic and doctrinal realities. There is a familiar doctrine that capitalist societies rely on private enterprise for innovation, risk-taking, discovery, creating the economy of the future. The doctrine is mostly myth. Most of this work takes place in the public sector or with public funding. That includes what we're now using: computers, internet, satellites, microelectronics, the rest of the high-tech economy. Also includes the vaccines that are rescuing us from today's plague. The results of this creative, innovative, risky work are then handed over to private enterprise for adaptation to the market. This brief summary draws the lines too sharply, of course, but it's not much of an exaggeration to describe the real economy as based on public subsidy, private profit. That was understood by US planners during World War II. In fact, they could see the achievements of state-funded research with their own eyes during the war years. Looking forward to the post-war era, national planners recognized that the US must have a highly developed state-based industrial policy if it is to maintain its position of global power. Much of this work was directed by Vannevar Bush, engineer who directed the highly productive research and development programs during the war years. And soon after that, became, in effect, the country's first presidential science advisor and a highly influential one. As Bush and others understood, it was necessary to have a highly developed state-based industrial policy. But there was a doctrinal problem. The notion industrial policy is anathema, according to official doctrine. It conflicts with reigning myths about free enterprise. There was fortuitously an easy solution. Implement industrial policy under Pentagon cover, selling it to Congress and the public as defense against savage enemies seeking to conquer the world and destroy us. It worked very well, not only in science and technology. So take, for example, the interstate highway system developed in the 1950s. Has an official name. It's the Dwight D. Eisenhower National System of Interstate and Defense Highways. And Eisenhower, who was no fool, was surely aware that the pretense of needing highways to transport missiles around the country was a marketing gimmick for Congress. The planners also understood that the way to achieve results is hands-off, the Haldane principle. Pentagon funding had no strings attached. After many years, some concerns began to be raised in Congress about the observance of the Haldane principle. In 1969, happens to be the year of my article on the crisis of university. In 1969, Congress passed the Mansfield Amendment, which barred the Pentagon from using its funds, I'm quoting, from using its funds to carry out any research project or study unless such project or study has a direct and apparent relationship to a specific military function, contrary to the practice of the past several decades. The narrow effect of that was that grant proposals were rewritten to fake a military function. But far broader developments were underway that had a much greater impact on the universities. These were the early years of a major transition of the socioeconomic system, transition from the regimented capitalism of the New Deal period, which persisted through the post-war years of very high, relatively egalitarian growth, transition from that to the neoliberal system that took off under Reagan and Thatcher, and that has prevailed since. There were major effects throughout the social order, not only in the United States and UK, but throughout the world under the impact of overwhelming US power and shared elite interests that initiated a major chapter of world history in which we are living right now. And the universities were not spared. In research universities like MIT, the transition led to a shift from government funding and the Haldane principle to corporate funding, which does not even have a formal commitment to the principle. Hence a shift towards more short-term applied projects under tighter control from funders, and for the first time, secrecy, which had never existed during the Pentagon funding years. Corporate funding, after all, makes no pretense of being for the common good. Funding is for me. That's the hallmark of the neoliberal ideology. That leads to the vulgarization that Collini describes, echoing Bourne's lament a century earlier. Well, this is very much a thumbnail sketch, so omitting a great deal of nuance, but I think the general contours are fairly accurate. Now, there are implications for university independence and academic freedom. Whatever the source of funding, the Haldane principle should prevail. It is undermined in principle under the rule of private power. The reasons are not obscure. Actually, they were articulated clearly enough as far back as Adam Smith. He recognized that those that he called the masters of mankind in his days, the merchants and manufacturers of England, he recognized that they would pursue what he called their vile maxim, all for ourselves, nothing for anyone else. And they were honest enough often to make it explicit. So the most respected academic neoliberal economist, Nobel laureate James Buchanan, instructs us plausibly that economics must accord with human nature. And he tells us what human nature is. The fundamental principle of human nature is each person seeks mastery over a world of slaves. That's your highest goal, in case you hadn't noticed. Well, unlike private funding, government support is not bound in principle by the vile maxim, but one can ask how far it strays from it in the light of another insight of Adam Smith's. The masters of mankind, he wrote, are the principal architects of government policy, and they make sure that their own interests are most peculiarly attended to, no matter how grievous the effect on others, in his day, on the people of England. Sometimes the masters feel that they can achieve a higher level of control. Reagan, Thatcher, neoliberalism is guided by that goal. Its basic principle, shared by associates elsewhere, is that decision-making should be shifted from governments, which are at least to some extent under public influence, should be shifted from there to concentrated private power, which is totally unaccountable to the public. That doctrine is masked in terms of the alleged miracle of markets, but the reality is pretty much what I've just described, as we've seen vividly for 40 years. I'll return briefly to that, but let's keep now to the crisis of the university system. Socioeconomic power and organization are closely linked to major currents of intellectual culture. Returning to Randolph Bourne a century ago, recall that he linked the dismal fate of the university ideal to a shift in the general intellectual culture, the rise of exigencies, pragmatic intellectuals committed, in his words, to the executive ordering of events in political administration and service of the war technique. That was a century ago. Bourne could have been describing the Kennedy intellectuals during the glory days of Camelot and the years that followed. They hailed themselves as technocratic and policy-oriented intellectuals as they micromanaged the escalation of the Vietnam War, among other achievements. They distinguished themselves from what were called the value-oriented intellectuals, These are old-fashioned types who haven't grasped the spirit of the age and wander in the mists of justice and rights and morality. They are the wild men in the wings, as they were described in 1968 by Kennedy Johnson, National Security Advisor, McGeorge Bundy, former Harvard Dean. He was referring to these fringe creatures who go beyond criticizing the tactics of the war planners to raising questions of motives and legitimacy. Randolph Bourne also was a wild man on the wings. There were very few such figures in all of the warring countries. For the most part, intellectuals rallied with remarkable unanimity and fervor to the call of the war machine. The more prominent ones who resisted the patriotic hysteria mostly ended up in jail. Bertrand Russell, Eugene Debs, Rosa Luxemburg, Karl Liebknecht, among others. Bourne himself was lucky. He was not jailed. He was only thrown out of the liberal intellectual journals of the John Dewey Circle. They were busy hailing the American intervention in the war as the first war in history initiated and run by the intelligent men of the society who deliberated rationally and determined the best path. That's their self-description, much like their Camelot descendants. Through the 1960s, there were conflicting tendencies developing in the general intellectual culture. Sophisticated intellectual discourse reflecting on the era adopts the framework I've just quoted, distinguishing the technocratic and policy-oriented intellectuals, sober, realistic, pragmatic, distinguishing them from the value-oriented intellectuals, the wild men in the wings. The value-oriented intellectuals may be a fringe, analysts recognize, but they're dangerous. Quoting prestigious sources, the value-oriented intellectuals pose a challenge to democratic government, which is potentially at least as serious as those posed in the past by aristocratic cliques, fascist movements, and communist parties. Among other misdeeds, these dangerous creatures devote themselves to derogation of leadership, challenging of authority. They even go so far as to cast a critical eye on the institutions responsible for the indoctrination of the young, the universities. Succumbing to challenges from these wild men, the institutions failed miserably in their task of indoctrination during the time of troubles. It's the standard phrase referring to the terrible 1960s. The failure of indoctrination was evident from the clamor in the streets demanding an end to the Vietnam War, the rising feminist agitation, and other popular movements of the 1960s. Still quoting, these popular movements posed a serious crisis of democracy. The crisis was that the state was overloaded. It could not respond to the demands of these special interests, as they're called, the young, the old, the women, workers, farmers, in brief, the general population. It's therefore necessary to have more moderation in democracy, a return to passivity, obedience, and conformity, so that the self-described responsible men can return to the management of public affairs without disruption. As for the universities, they must take themselves in hand and devote themselves effectively to indoctrination of the young if the crisis of democracy is to be overcome. I've been quoting for the last few minutes, quoting from a crucial document of the mid-1970s. It's the first publication of the Trilateral Commission. It's constituted of liberal internationalists from the United States, Europe, and Japan. That's the left end of the respectable spectrum. Carter administration, for example, was drawn almost entirely from their ranks. For lack of time, I'll ignore the right end of the spectrum, the main business community, which was much more severe in its condemnation of the terrible crimes of the 1960s, which included a fall in the rate of profit and a rise in labor militancy, particularly among the young, often led by women and minorities. To the guardians of established order, left and right, these were frightening times. The crisis of democracy was real. Across a very broad spectrum, popular groups were organizing, pressing their demands in the public arena. They were not quietly accepting the principles of liberal democratic theory, which I'll quote from the highest sources. The principles are that the public are spectators, not participants in political action. They do have what's called a function. Their function is to appear every few years to select a member of the intelligent minority who must be protected from the roar and trampling of the bewildered herd, the stupid and ignorant majority, benighted creatures who must be saved from their own irrational whims and impulses. We must put aside democratic dogmatisms about people understanding their own interests. They do not. We do. They should return to their function of passive conformity. Actually, I've been quoting the icons of liberal democratic theory, Wilson, Roosevelt, Kennedy liberals, Walter Lippmann, the leading 20th century public intellectual, Reinhold Niebuhr, known as the theologian of the liberal establishment, Harold Lasswell, founder of modern political science. The Trilateral Commission study of the crisis of democracy was echoing these sentiments, which have deep roots in intellectual culture. For the universities, the implications were evident and not concealed. Discipline must be restored, indoctrination made more rigid. With the neoliberal reconstruction of the social order, it was only natural that universities should be subjected to a business model with a sharp growth in many layers of administration, a shift from faculty control to administrative control, and imposition of business style efficiency. One element of efficiency is to seek cheap and easily disciplined labor. That means replacement of tenured faculty who run their own affairs by temporary labor, paid a pittance, no security, adjuncts, graduate students. A concomitant has been radical defunding of public education, sharp rise in tuition, greater reliance on private funding with the anticipated consequences, not just colleges, but mass public education as well. I should say that that's particularly ironic in the United States. One of the great achievements of American democracy was initiation of mass public education and publicly funded higher education. Now it must be smashed under the neoliberal hammer. It's all fully in the spirit of the neoliberal assault on the general society. The term assault is properly chosen. It's not our topic here, so I won't go into it in detail, but it is the essential background to the current crisis of educational institutions. Shouldn't be entirely ignored. Just keeping to the United States, the quasi-governmental RAND Corporation recently released a study of the wealth transferred from the working class and the middle class, the lower 90% of the population in income, transferred from them to the super rich since Reagan. It's about $50 trillion, not small change. Meanwhile, the top 0.1%, not 1%, 0.1% has seen their wealth doubled to 20% of the country's wealth. The RAND conclusions are actually a vast underestimate of the wholesale robbery. It's a more accurate term than the polite word transfer. Its scale almost doubles when we take into account the other forms of robbery that were unleashed when Reagan opened the spigots: tax havens, shell companies, rules of corporate governance, allowing CEOs to select the boards that determine their remunerations, sharp cutback of government monitors so that the rich can evade taxes at will, and much more. The tax system has been radically modified to the benefit of extreme wealth and corporate power. There's a pretext. The pretext is that this would increase investment and jobs. The effect has been the exact opposite. It's reviewed in detail in the current issue of the major establishment journal, Foreign Affairs, by economist Joseph Stiglitz, several colleagues. They write that nothing could be further than the truth than the 40-year-old pretext. In fact, what is truly extreme is the experiment in taxation that began during the Reagan era, when tax rates on the rich and corporations began their dramatic descent. The results have been clear: slow growth, high deficits, and unprecedented inequality. Much the same has been true elsewhere under the neoliberal hammer blows, leading to anger, resentment, contempt for political institution, the rise of demagogues who channel justified anger towards scapegoats, immigrants, minorities, the usual vulnerable targets. There's plenty of work to be done to overcome the impact of this assault. Meanwhile, academic freedom is under attack in more conventional ways. In the United States, there's no more crucial issue than 400 years of vicious racist repression with a hideous legacy, and along with it, the persistence of savage doctrines of white supremacy. Decades of hard work, of education, popular organizing have significantly raised understanding of these crimes in scholarship and the public domain, a significant, even if partial, achievement. And there's a backlash. In Republican-run states, legislation is being passed to ban instruction in what's called critical race theory. That's the new demon, replacing communism and Islamic terror as the plague of the modern age. Critical race theory is the scare phrase used for the study of systematic, structural, and cultural factors in the hideous 400-year history of slavery and enduring racism. Proper indoctrination in schools and universities must ban this heresy by law. What actually happened for 400 years and is very much alive today must be presented to students as deviation from the real America. That's the content of the laws being passed. It's not the only current massive blow to academic freedom. I take that phrase from the words of a remarkable letter published a few days ago in the British Medical Journal. It's written by a scholar from the Irish Centre on Human Rights, two distinguished associates. The topic of the letter is what they describe quite accurately as an unprecedented act of political censorship in academic journals. Now, they're referring to a decision of the world's leading medical journal, The Lancet, Britain, a decision to remove from its website a report it had published on, quoting, on the potential of the pandemic to devastate one of the world's most vulnerable populations. The report provided details of the shocking health conditions in Gaza that prevailed prior to the recent bombings, which had a further devastating effect on this open-air prison where 2 million people, half children, have been subjected to a crushing siege by the occupying power for 15 years, so severe that there's virtually no potable water. Health system is wrecked. International monitors warn that the territory is on the verge of becoming unlivable. But the facts cannot be reported because of threats of boycott by doctors, mostly from the US. The authors of the letter, the British Medical Journal, term the outcome epistemicide of Palestinian history and present realities. Can stand alongside the epistemicide of American history and present realities under the rule of the Republican Party, which mainstream political commentators now describe as no longer a parliamentary party, but a radical insurgency that has abandoned democratic practices. Epistemicide is a useful concept. It's now rampant, including the most powerful state in human history. I'll mention only the most consequential of many examples. Yale University carries out regular studies of popular opinion on global warming, the most important issue that has arisen in human history, with the fate of the human experiment at stake and not much time to determine whether the experiment is reaching an inglorious end. The current study, which was released a few days ago, reports, I'll quote it now, reports that over the past year, there has been a sharp decline in the percentages of both liberal moderate Republicans and conservative Republicans who think developing sources of clean energy should be a priority for the president and Congress. The current numbers are all-time lows since we first asked the question in 2010. Those are frightening numbers. It's the result of epistemicide with a vengeance, a campaign that's been carried out with particular fervor since 2010 when the question was first asked. At that time, the Republican Party was beginning to toy with mild measures on climate change. In his 2008 presidential campaign, Republican candidate John McCain had a limited plank on global warming. That set in motion a juggernaut launched by the huge Koch brothers energy conglomerate to end any such deviation from its commitment to end organized human life on Earth in the interest of short-term profit. The party capitulated totally, and since has been completely denialist. Trump only carried the crime to caricature. The capitulation carried with it the party's echo chamber, Murdoch's Fox News, along with the talk radio network owned by far-right corporations, and the rest of the vast disinformation system that has exploded during the neoliberal years. Throughout the storm, the university system, with all its internal problems, remains an island of relative sanity. The noble ideal that Bourne invoked is battered but resilient, and to ensure its survival and expand its reach is a task of prime significance in these deeply troubled times.
Thank you very much, Noam, for a wonderful talk. My apologies for having missed the introduction that I was going to present, but since, as my colleague Daniel Kaiser mentioned, you need no introduction, so I think that was an acceptable omission. And welcome back to Ireland. This is your 5th visit to us, but on this occasion only virtually. You have a very large audience, as you have had in the past, and a number of questions. I'll go through a few questions with you, and we'll see whether there's time for more. The first question I'd like to put to you is from the Irish Federation of University Teachers and its president, Dr. Anthony Harvey. And I think the question would be of interest to you, knowing your background with trade unions. Dr. Harvey asks, what potential role do you see for the trade union movement in protecting academic freedom? How could this sort of activity be engaged, and what sort of reciprocity could academics appropriately provide? So the role of academic freedom and in connection with trade union movement.
Well, we should, first of all, recognize that since the 19th century, the union movement, labor union movement, has been in the forefront of protecting human rights, civil rights, advancing freedom, social justice. All of these, the trade union movement has been in the lead. It's the main reason it's under severe attack constantly. The United States, dramatically, the United States has an unusually violent history of union repression and destruction. It's also the reason why at the beginning of the neoliberal assault, Reagan and Thatcher, or whoever was doing their thinking for them, recognized that one of their first tasks must be to destroy the union movement. If you're going to carry out a major assault against the general population, the kind I briefly mentioned, you have to ensure that they have no defense. And the main defense of working people spearheading the struggle for others, the main defense is the union movement. So that has to be crushed. was their first target, and it's had an enormous effect. As soon as they opened the doors, corporate sector marched in, began to use what previously had been illegal techniques like scabs to break strikes. So Clinton in the United States contributed to this, went on to the point where unions practically don't exist. Now there's a very close relationship between union membership and inequality. The higher union membership, the lower the inequality. Conversely, the reason is quite obvious. Unions are the means for defense of working people and defense of other values too. It's very striking what's happening in the United States related to the question that was just raised. There is a rise in labor militancy among teachers, non-unionized teachers in very right-wing states. West Virginia, Arizona, where I live, teachers have been leading strikes, major strikes, calling not only for improvement of their miserable wages. As I said, there's been terrible defunding during the neoliberal years, not only for that, but also for better circumstances, better conditions for students, reduced classroom sizes, nurses in schools, and they're getting enormous public support, even in very conservative states. In Arizona, where I live, you take a look at signs on people's lawns, highly supportive of the workers' strikes for better education, massive struggle in the legislature, mass public pressure to try to institute this regime, the Republican legislators fighting back. We have to keep defunding the schools. A major struggle with the labor movement reconstituting in the forefront of it. Same is true on the university level. There have been finally strikes by graduate students, by adjuncts, faculty support. The University of Arizona, where I teach right now, just a couple of months ago, organized its first union of faculty and staff to try to defend the basic principles, this noble ideal that Bourne discussed and that Michael D. Higgins expounded. So now we have a union which is struggling for this against the force of the legislative efforts to crush it and control it. This can happen, this should happen everywhere, not just in the universities, but across the board. If we're to escape from the crushing effects of this assault of the last 40 years, the union movement, a revitalized union movement, will have to be at the forefront, as it's been in the past. And that can happen. The labor movement has risen from the ashes before. Go back to my childhood, 1930s. In the 1920s in the United States, the labor movement had been almost totally crushed, mostly by state and corporate violence. There was almost nothing left of it. The early 30s began to reconstitute. CIO began to organize, started militant labor actions. Pretty soon it had moved on to truly militant actions like sit-down strikes, which are a serious threat to prevailing power. That's one step before saying, we don't need bosses. We can run this by ourselves. The traditional stand of the labor movement from the 19th century. At that point, the Supreme Court stopped banning New Deal measures. major corporations recognized they're going to have to conform to the rising public pressure. New Deal measures were passed, turned the United States towards a mildly social democratic society with very beneficial results to the mass of the population. Neoliberal assault has been trying to reverse this. Can happen again, can happen in Britain, can happen in Ireland, can happen elsewhere. And it's a prerequisite for moving on to a much better world.
Thank you very much. The next question, there is a series of questions all on the topic of funding and higher education. For instance, Asil Telly asks, and thank you for opening the topic of Pentagon-funded research, and asks whether universities in America or beyond can do without aid from military research. And in the same vein, a different question has come about how universities should be funded in order for us to manage to avoid structural injustices, including structural racism.
Well, the best solution would be for universities to be publicly funded by a democratic, participatory public, where the public is not just spectators, but participants in deciding what is the way for our educational institutions to function. That would be a very positive development. Public generally is in favor of better public institutions, better educational institutions, free research and inquiry, and so on. This should be an informed public which understands how it works. As far as if the educational system is privately funded, we can expect exactly what Adam Smith described. Private funding is not, well, there are exceptions, but in principle, it's, for me, it's not even in principle bound by anything like the Haldane principle or the common good. You can find an exception here and there, but that's its fundamental nature. It's obvious. When you have government funding, depends on the nature of the government and the extent to which the government is independent itself from the control by private power. Well, the point is we need a democratic polity, participatory democratic polity with an informed, engaged public. To the extent you can achieve that, you can have decent funding of the universities and the schools, I should say. And it has been done. As far as the military is concerned, as I said, there was a period of extensive Pentagon funding. MIT, where I was, is a major example, almost entirely funded by the Pentagon. No military work on campus, none. Some by the political science department, nothing anywhere else. Of course, almost anything that's done in the university is of military significance, from anthropology to zoology. The military, no matter how it's funded, no matter where it's done, will of course be looking for ways to use it. If you're an anthropologist working on hill tribesmen, the Pentagon will be interested in your results because they'll want to know how to control hill tribesmen. That's a matter of the nature of the society, not of the universities. The universities should be funded, and for a long time were, under the Haldane principle. You don't exert, the funders exert no control over the research that's being done. And it was very successful. That's the basis for our high-tech economy. That's the way in which a university like MIT made a transition from an engineering school to a science-based university with major programs in philosophy, my own field, linguistics, cognitive science, history, anthropology, and so on. This was under free funding under the Haldane principle. Can be done, but to the extent that you have private funding by corporate power, by private individuals, rich private individuals, there's going to be distortions. And to the extent that the funding is done by a government that is under those influences, as is the case in the struggle I described right here in Arizona, to the extent that that's true, of course, it'll cause a battle, constant battle, to try to protect university integrity and academic freedom from these external forces.
Thank you very much. A related question has come from Eric Bullings, who asks or states that since academia seems generally organized in a rather hierarchical way, how safe is our belief in academic freedom?
There is an intrinsic hierarchic structure to even the most ideal university or college. It's the case that the faculty is going to set the curriculum, not necessarily alone, can be done with interaction of student and faculty, but there's going to be a preponderant role of the faculty for very good and obvious reasons. Interaction is, consultation is possible, justified. Could give many examples from my own experience where it's been very healthy, but in the end, there is going to be a dominant role by faculty, including senior faculty, in making basic decisions about the educational curriculum. That's unavoidable. Now, the question of any further hierarchy beyond that, it's very dubious, I should say. Go back to the 1950s and 60s, my own university, MIT, the administration was essentially drawn from the faculty. There were members of the faculty who temporarily took on administrative jobs, returned to the faculty. You knew who they were. If you had questions, call them, talk to your friend, the provost, who co-teaches a course with your colleagues, and talk to them about it. That changed a lot during the last 40 years, not just at MIT, everywhere, with the business model imposing level after level of control, hierarchy, administration, deans, subdeans, secretaries of subdeans, and so on, more remoteness of administration from faculty and more trustee control, which means private control. That's the neoliberal model. There are some careful studies of this if you're interested. Sociologist Benjamin Ginsberg has a major book called The Fall of the Faculty, which describes all of this in detail, but it's the experience of anyone in a university. That's imposition of the business model. It imposes levels of hierarchy and control with the goal of better indoctrination, term that is used, not mine, theirs, and efficiency in the sense that I described. Same is true elsewhere. There's been significant attack on university structure. But to go back to the question, there is an element of hierarchy which isn't going to be eliminated. It's incoming students are not going to design the curriculum and the philosophy courses or the physics courses. That's ineliminable.
Thank you very much. There's a question from Richard Teague, who asks if you think academics these days in the US and Europe are generally more complicit with unjust concentrations of power than they were, let's say, in the 60s, or when you published The Responsibility of Intellectuals.
Well, that's the reason why I began by quoting Randolph Bourne a century ago. His eloquent words are very apt today, over a century. In the 1960s, there was a lot of ferment. The description of the 1960s that I gave from the Trilateral Commission is pretty accurate. And it's also the perception of the liberal intellectual elite. Just to repeat the essence, there are two groups of intellectuals: the technocratic, policy-oriented intellectuals, pragmatic, realistic, the good guys, on the one hand, sober, trying to solve problems, and then the value-oriented intellectuals, the bad guys, the ones who derogate authority, challenge authoritarian practices, call for justice and freedom, who were a small minority, but they did exist and were considered a serious danger by the sober intellectuals of the liberal establishment. That was the crisis of democracy. The actual effect of the 60s was to substantially civilize the society. There was a complete breakthrough in scholarship, in general consciousness about major issues. Until the 1960s, in the most sophisticated, advanced anthropology departments, if you learned about Native Americans, you would be taught that when the colonists arrived, there was a scattering of hunter-gatherers roaming around the country, and no organized society, very backward. Colonists brought civilization and so on. That was the line through the 1960s in scholarship, the most advanced scholarship. Totally false. We now know, thanks to the work that was done, late 60s, early 70s, finally broke into the profession. We know that these were advanced societies, high intellectual culture, more so than the colonists in many ways. Lots of development, cities, trade from South America up to the north. Very developed society. They were behind Europe in savagery. It's true. Europe had an enormous advantage in savagery. That's how it was able to conquer most of the world. But in other respects, and also in the technology of war, there's a famous ditty, I guess maybe Ambrose Bierce saying, whatever happens, we have got the Gatling gun and they have not. In other words, we can kill them in mass murder and they can't. Well, that's true. That's European savagery, which was honed, incidentally, in centuries of savage war inside Europe. 17th century, the 30 Years' War, fought over how you should pray. It wiped out maybe a third of the population of Germany. Massive, destructive war. A large part of the history of Europe was savage internal war, which created a culture of a science of war, as military historians called it, which enabled Europeans to conquer the world, but and to carry out mass genocide. But that was the main advantage. That's now pretty well understood. You look at scholarship now, same thing. What about slavery? Slavery was barely understood in the 1960s. It was, Pearl Buck's picture of the happy plantation bestsellers. Just even up till recently, the real history of slavery, hideous, horrible slavery, is just being unearthed. And it's led to a change in popular consciousness. In the 1960s in the United States, there were still laws, anti-miscegenation laws, which were so extreme that the Nazis refused to accept them. There were anti-sodomy laws lasting into the 21st century. In England, it was in many ways even worse. Remember that England murdered one of the greatest mathematicians of the 20th century, also a war hero who helped save Britain from the Nazi air attacks, Alan Turing. He was murdered by the British government, basically, by forced treatment to cure his homosexuality. And it was only very recently, a year or two ago, that there was finally a kind of a muted pardon for that crime. That was the pre-60s world. That changed enormously with major civilizing effects. It's a large part of the reason for the backlash. Okay? When you ask what was happening in the universities, it reflected it. This was the claims that the universities were taken over by radical Marxists who want to destroy everything, are wild exaggeration. But they were a scene of debate, discussion, action, protest, bringing in parts of the faculty, fringe of the faculty, leading to the interpretations that I was quoting before. And it's continued. With all the attempts to impose indoctrination, there's probably more activism on campus now than there was then. Scattered, diffuse, but very serious.
Thank you very much. I often think of you as the conscience of the academic world, and you have persisted with your fight against all kinds of injustice for practically 70 years now. So there are questions about you, your role, and I think it is appropriate for me to ask these questions because you are a role model for so many younger academics. So the first question, and feel free not to answer the question if it's not appropriate, but the first question is, has there been a time in your academic career that you felt your own academic freedom was under threat, and how did you overcome it?
Well, I was very lucky. Plenty of people did have their, were young faculty, particularly younger faculty, more vulnerable ones. Many had their academic careers injured or destroyed. Not a huge number, but enough so that it's a major tragedy. Could list examples. I myself was lucky. I was at MIT, as I said, Pentagon funded, very free. I was actually, the laboratory where I worked, research laboratory of electronics, 100% funded by the armed services, was the center, national center for resistance against the Vietnam War, not protest, resistance, support for draft resistance, other resistance activities against the war. There were plenty of threats, but they never got back to us. The faculty who were participating were protected, even when they went. I mean, I personally happened to be, I came very close to I was indicted in a federal trial. Trial was finally called off, but I could have spent many years in jail. But throughout all this period, there was never any attack at all on freedom, on academic freedom. I was actually teaching undergraduate courses on my own time on many of these issues, but the administration didn't like it particularly, but didn't do anything about it. They were happy to offer us rooms so I could teach in the evening, bring in community people and so on. All of that was very free. I think there was repression. We shouldn't overlook it, and it was serious. But by and large, the record of protection of academic freedom was not too bad. Some places very good.
Thank you. And one other question about your person. How does Professor Chomsky find the emotional energy to keep talking out against injustices that simply repeat over and over?
It's very easy. All you have to do is pay attention to the people who are really heroic, the unknown people who are on the ground constantly doing the work which lays the basis for the kind of protest that reaches visibility. So take, say, the civil rights movement. When you're asked about the US civil rights movement, the name that comes to mind is Martin Luther King, who was a major figure and a very admirable figure. But he would have been the first to say that he was riding the crest of a wave. He wouldn't have become known at all or influential if it wasn't for the fact that young students from the SNCC, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, young Black students, were going through the rural South in freedom buses, trying to encourage Black farmers to dare to face the raging white mobs and cast a vote. Suffering, sometimes killed. Dangerous, difficult work. Some white students joined them. A couple of Black students in 1960 sat in on a segregated lunch counter in Greensboro, North Carolina. Of course, immediately arrested, sent off to jail. Could have ended it, except that more came the next day. Pretty soon, some white students from the North joined. Pretty soon, you had a major popular movement. Those are the things that are happening everywhere you look. Take today. We have, I mentioned that the most important issue in human history is the crisis, imminent crisis of environmental destruction. What's being done about it? Well, for example, in the United States, a resolution was just introduced in Congress by Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Ed Markey, Senator from Massachusetts, which does lay out the details of an effective Green New Deal that could rescue us from the crisis. Hasn't reached the level of legislation, but it's a resolution. It's a big advance from a couple of years ago. How did it happen? By large-scale activism of mostly young people. Extinction Rebellion, Global Climate Strike, Sunrise Movement, young activists in the US who sat in congressional offices. You just watch these people all over the world. It's inspiring. And even more inspiring is when if you're able to, you actually get to the places where people are miserably suffering, the real victims. Gaza, where I mentioned, Southern Colombia, refugee camps in Lebanon, southeastern Turkey with their vicious repression of Kurds. Go to those places and see the people who are constantly struggling against incredibly difficult, severe, brutal conditions. They don't give up. How can we in our privileged little islands even dream of doing anything but giving them whatever assistance we can?
Thank you very much for that response. It is inspiring to all the younger people who are listening and hopefully will follow in your footsteps in their own distinct ways. There's a question from Anonymous who asks, what should universities do to ensure that ideological myopia is kept in check and that a broader range of different philosophies are taught and discussed? And I would like to merge that question with a different question on your views on cancel culture and whether it is correct not to give platform to certain speakers, right-wing or whatever.
Well, let's take the deplatforming. First of all, let's recognize that deplatforming is a very old practice, conventional practice. The left has been mostly deplatformed for decades. Try to find, until very recently, changed in recent years, mostly because of the activism that I described, but until very recently, try to find an economics professor in the United States who was a Marxist or a socialist. Almost impossible. The mainstream canon has changed recently, but the mainstream educational establishment was able to keep ideological control quite narrow in the more sensitive fields. That's deplatforming. I could give you many examples from my own experience of meetings broken up, need for police protection if you're talking about certain topics, invitations canceled because of alumni pressure, things like that. It happens all the time. Nobody talks about it because it's directed against the left. But let's talk about what's now discussed, the deplatforming of some right-wing speaker. What should you do if you're on campus and somebody is invited, say by a student group who supports what you regard as horrendous views? Well, there's two choices. One choice is to say, keep them off campus. We want to be pure. It's wrong in principle. It's tactically suicidal. You're giving a gift, a very welcome gift to the forces that are deplatformed. They love it. They can stand up and present themselves as noble defenders of academic freedom against these fascists who are trying to prevent free discourse. You can see it over and over. In fact, the Republican Party in the last election was one of their main campaign planks. They love it. There's another approach. Let the person come to campus. Why not? Set up a counter meeting where you go into the issues, use it as an educational opportunity, develop understanding of the issues. You gain something. Those are the choices. It's a constant choice. Deplatforming is the absolute worst choice, both in principle and in consequences.
Thank you very much. And what about diversity in approaches, philosophical approaches in academic research?
Sorry, I didn't.
There was a second part to the question about how to ensure that there is diversity in philosophical approaches and research methods, etc.
Well, first of all, we should recognize that there's always going to be constraints on diversity. Take the United States. There's a recent study by one of the major nonprofit independent institutions that studies religious attitudes. They had discovered that among Republicans, again, among the Republican base, maybe 25% believe in what is now could say a new religion, which has about the same support as the as white evangelicals, major Protestant religions. This is a belief that the country is run by pedophiles, by satanic pedophiles who are running an international sex ring. It's about 25% of Republicans. Do we have to teach that on campus? No, we don't. Any more than we have to teach other cults on campus. So yes, even though this is a substantial part of the public that supports it. On the other hand, within a range of relatively reasonable views, there should be considerable freedom in what is up for discussion and debate. If it can withstand serious discussion and critical analysis, then it should be part of the university environment. There's no algorithm to answer this question. It's a judgment call all the time. And you can make mistakes, even in the hard sciences, where it's easier to do. So take the case of, famous case of David Bohm, great physicist whose views were considered so outrageous that they were not even, you couldn't even discuss them in the physics world. Well, by now they're taken seriously. Same was true of the original work on multiverses in physics. The first proponents were so harshly condemned, they just dropped out of the field. Now it's considered a respectable idea. You can give many examples of this. Actually, it's true of my own field. We were, for years, we couldn't, my associates just couldn't publish in linguistics journals because it was considered too crazy. Actually, I had to start our own journals to try to have an avenue, a place to be able to publish. Okay, by now it's a major field in the world. You can make mistakes, but you have to have some level of judgment. And the principle should be, this general principle is pretty clear. If some position can credibly offer a defense of its positions in an atmosphere of critical, open inquiry, then it has a fair place in the academic curriculum.
Thank you, Professor Chomsky. You have been engaging with your audience for almost an hour and a half directly and live. So I think we should call this session to a close. But I would like to ask you to finish by answering one more point, and that is, are you hopeful for the future of academia and young academics? Is there reason for hope?
Well, I'm often asked that question, and I go back to a kind of variant of Pascal's wager. We have two choices. We can be pessimistic, say nothing's possible, let's give up and help ensure that the worst will happen. Or we can recognize that there are opportunities. We can't estimate how rich and powerful they are, but they do exist, and we can grasp them, work hard on them, maybe help make the world a better place. It's not much of a choice.
Thank you very much, and thank you for your continued contribution to a fight that is ahead of all of us in decades to come. Thank you, Noam.
Thank you.